My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm in my mid 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady, dependable, calm, the one who doesn't make scenes. I work with numbers for a living, live a fairly quiet life, and I've always believed that if you keep your head down and do right by people, things eventually balance out. Most people underestimate me, not because I pretend to be small, but because I don't announce my strength. I don't argue loudly. I don't dominate conversations. I listen. I observe. And because of that, I'm often mistaken for someone who doesn't notice much at all. This story isn't about rage. It isn't about revenge. And it isn't about winning in the way movies like to frame it. It's about something slower, quieter, more uncomfortable. It's about what happens when trust is treated like a renewable resource. My family used my name to take a $90,000 loan, and if that sentence alone makes your chest tighten, I understand. But this story is not just about money. Money is measurable. What broke here wasn't just financial, it was relational, psychological, and deeply personal. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who already know which parts of you are soft. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I went from being the invisible, reliable one in my family to someone they no longer recognized. Not because I changed my values, but because I finally applied them to myself. You'll hear about small moments most people would dismiss, conversations that didn't sound alarming at the time, decisions I didn't realize were being made around me instead of with me, and the long stretch of silence where nothing seemed wrong until everything was. There will be no shouting matches in this story, no dramatic confrontations in kitchens or courtrooms, no villain speeches, just a series of quiet realizations, careful choices, and consequences that unfolded whether anyone was ready for them or not. I'm telling this honestly, not to paint myself as perfect, not to ask for sympathy, and not to encourage anyone to burn bridges. I'm telling it because there are many people listening right now who have been the responsible one for so long that they don't realize how exposed that makes them. If you've ever been trusted so completely that no one thought to ask for your consent, if you've ever stayed quiet because speaking up felt disruptive, if you've ever wondered when silence stopped being patience and started becoming permission, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at a moment and realized the betrayal didn't start where you thought it did? Between reliance and entitlement. I didn't know yet where that line had been crossed. I only knew that I was tired in a way rest didn't fix, that I felt responsible for things I hadn't chosen, that my name carried obligations I hadn't agreed to. Still, I stayed quiet, because this was my family, because nothing bad had happened yet, because I believed that if something ever did, I would feel it immediately. I was wrong about that. Some shifts are too subtle to hurt at first. They don't announce themselves. They settle in gently, the way weight does when you've been carrying it for so long you forget what it felt like to stand without it. And that's who I was to them, the one who could carry a little more. The first time it happened, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like a misunderstanding. It was a passing comment, almost careless. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the kind of evening that feels ordinary enough to blur at the edges. Someone mentioned paperwork. Another person joked about how I was basically the family accountant anyway. There was laughter. I smiled because that's what you do when something lands slightly wrong, but you don't want to disrupt the moment. Then my mother said, "Well, your name is already on most things. It just makes sense." Already on most things. I asked what she meant lightly, curious, not alarmed. She waved it off, said it wasn't important, said I worried too much about details. That should have been the moment I pressed, but I didn't, because pressing felt dramatic, because I didn't want to be the person who turns a harmless comment into a conversation everyone regrets. So I let it go. A few weeks later, I noticed a notification on my credit monitoring app. Nothing alarming, just an inquiry. I assumed it was an error or maybe something I'd forgotten. Life was busy. Work deadlines, normal stress. I told myself I'd look into it later. Later came and went. The second small cut was subtler. A document was left open on a desk when I stopped by unannounced. Numbers I didn't recognize. My name typed neatly at the top. When I asked about it, the answer came too fast. Oh, that? It's nothing finalized. Nothing finalized is a strange phrase. It sounds reassuring, but it doesn't actually explain anything. It just implies you're not supposed to worry yet. I nodded. Again, everyone else ignored it. Or maybe they didn't see it as something that concerned me. That's the tricky part about families. You assume shared context means shared awareness, but sometimes it just means shared blind spots. I remember the exact moment my stomach tightened, not sharply, not enough to cause panic, just a small internal pull, like your body noticing something before your mind is ready to name it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I reminded myself that trust is a choice you make daily, not something you revoke over half-formed thoughts. I didn't want to become suspicious of the people who raised me, who celebrated my milestones, who had always been there. So I stayed silent. The cuts didn't hurt because they were small. They hurt because they were dismissed, because each one came with a reassurance that made questioning feel unreasonable. You're overthinking it. It's just temporary. We'll explain later. Later never comes unless you demand it. What I didn't realize then was that every time I chose not to ask, I was teaching them something about me, that my discomfort was negotiable, that clarity wasn't urgent, that my consent could be assumed if the cause felt justified enough. And maybe they didn't mean harm. Maybe they truly believed they were protecting me from stress, from complexity, from involvement. Intent is slippery like that. It can sound kind even when the outcome isn't. But impact doesn't care about intention. I remember lying awake one night, replaying those moments, the comment, the document, the notification, lining them up like dots and wondering whether I was allowed to connect them. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't confront. I didn't even journal about it. I just noted it quietly, the way you note a crack in the wall you don't yet know how serious it is. That was the first real cut. Not what they did, but how easily I convinced myself it didn't matter. Because once you teach yourself to ignore the small injuries, you stop recognizing when the damage becomes structural. And by the time everyone else notices something is wrong, you've already been bleeding for a while. After that, the pattern settled in. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make for a clear warning sign. It slipped into daily life the way background noise does, present, persistent, easy to ignore if you don't focus on it. There were more comments about how responsible I was, more jokes about me being the safest option, more moments where conversations paused when I entered the room, then resumed with a slightly different tone. I noticed, but I told myself it was a coincidence. I didn't want to believe I was being managed instead of included. Every time something felt off, there was a ready explanation. We didn't want to bother you. You've got enough on your plate. It's already handled. Handled by whom? On whose authority? Those questions stayed in my head, unspoken, because asking them would have shifted the dynamic, and I wasn't ready to do that. I started rationalizing my silence in ways that sounded noble. I told myself I was choosing peace, that not every discomfort needed a response, that maturity meant letting go of the need to be consulted on everything. But deep down, I knew the difference between letting go and being edged out. I just wasn't ready to admit which one was happening. The thing about normalized disrespect is that it rarely arrives labeled as such. It arrives wrapped in familiarity, in shared jokes, in reassurances that sound loving if you don't listen too closely. I noticed how often my name was used as a reference point. Evelyn would agree with this. This is the kind of thing Evelyn understands. She won't mind. No one asked anymore. They narrated my agreement into existence. And because I didn't interrupt the story, it became easier for them to believe it was true. There was a moment, small but clear, when I realized something had shifted. A family member asked me to sign something just to keep things moving. I skimmed it, felt a flicker of concern, and hesitated. They sighed. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough to communicate inconvenience. Enough to remind me of the unspoken rule. Don't be the obstacle. So I signed. That was when I started understanding how roles trap you. Once you're known as the cooperative one, hesitation feels like betrayal. To them, your boundaries become disruptions, your questions become accusations, and you start managing other people's comfort at the expense of your own clarity. I told myself I could always revisit things later, that if something truly serious was happening, it would be made explicit, that I wasn't being excluded, I was being spared. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. It was easier for them not to involve me, and I had made it easy by not insisting on visibility. The respect I thought I had earned was conditional. It existed only as long as I didn't challenge the assumptions attached to my name. I wasn't angry yet, I was confused, disoriented, like realizing you've been standing in the wrong room for a while, but no one told you because you weren't in the way. And still, I stayed quiet. Because calling something disrespectful requires you to accept that it is, and that realization carries responsibility. It means you have to decide what you're willing to lose to protect yourself. At that point, I wasn't ready to risk the image of harmony I'd spent years maintaining. I wasn't ready to imagine my family as people capable of crossing lines instead of just blurring them. So I adapted. I minimized. I told myself this was temporary, circumstantial, understandable. That's how normalization works. It doesn't force you into silence, it convinces you that silence is reasonable. And once disrespect feels normal, anything else starts to feel like an overreaction. I didn't wake up one morning and realize I had been assigned a role. It happened gradually, through repetition, until the outline of it became impossible to ignore. I was the reliable one, not just dependable, but usable. The person whose stability could be borrowed without question. The one whose life looked orderly enough to support other people's messes. Whenever something needed continuity, my name came up. Whenever something needed legitimacy, my signature mattered. I was no longer just part of the family. I was infrastructure. No one said this out loud, but it was reflected in how conversations flowed around me instead of toward me, in how plans were framed as updates rather than discussions, in how my consent was treated as a formality rather than a choice. They spoke as if I had already agreed, and in a way I had by default. I realized my role wasn't about trust anymore. It was about utility. I was useful because I was predictable, because I didn't explode, because I didn't leave, because I didn't ask, what happens to me if this goes wrong? That question never entered the room. I remember sitting quietly during one discussion about finances, listening to everyone talk in hypotheticals, best case scenarios, future payoffs, temporary strain. I waited for someone to turn to me and ask how I felt about it. No one did. Instead, someone said, "Evelyn's fine with risk, she's smart." That sentence changed something in me. Not because it was false, I am careful, informed, capable, but it was used to justify excluding me from the decision itself. My intelligence had become a reason not to explain things to me. My composure had become evidence that I wouldn't object. I wasn't being protected. I was being positioned. The role came with expectations I had never agreed to: absorb stress, smooth outcomes, and provide credibility. If something worked, it was collective. If it failed, I would be expected to understand. And still, I didn't push back. Part of me believed this was what adulthood looked like: quiet responsibility, unspoken sacrifice. Part of me feared that questioning the role would fracture the family. And part of me, if I'm honest, had tied my sense of worth to being the one who could handle it. But roles like this don't stay neutral, they escalate. Once you accept being the reliable one, people start relying on you for things that should require consent. Once you don't object, your silence becomes precedent. I began to feel a strange distance during family gatherings. I was present, but not really included. People spoke freely, assuming alignment. I smiled, nodded, and participated just enough to maintain normalcy. Inside, something was tightening. I wasn't angry yet, I was alert. I started noticing what wasn't said, what wasn't asked, how often my name appeared in plans I hadn't seen. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't accuse, I simply watched. That was the shift. I stopped being just the role they assigned me and started becoming a witness to it. And once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it because you realize something unsettling. The role exists whether you accept it or not. The only difference is whether you continue performing it for free. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where someone finally said the wrong thing. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, in my car. I had just come from a routine appointment, the kind you don't think twice about. While sitting in the parking lot, my phone buzzed with an alert. Another notification from my credit monitoring app. This one wasn't vague, it was specific. A balance I didn't recognize, an amount too large to dismiss, a structure too formal to be accidental. I didn't panic. That surprised me. I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, breathing evenly, reading the details again and again. My name was there, my information, my responsibility. And for the first time, I didn't rush to find an explanation that made everyone else innocent. Instead, I asked myself a different question. What if this wasn't a misunderstanding? That question landed quietly, but it changed everything. I drove home slowly, not in shock, just thinking, replaying conversations, recalling phrases I had brushed off, the casual confidence with which my name had been used, the documents I hadn't fully seen, the assumptions I had never corrected. It wasn't anger that filled the space, it was clarity. I realized that whether or not anyone had intended to hurt me was no longer the point. Impact had already occurred. Responsibility had already been transferred to me without my consent. And silence, in this moment, would not be patience, it would be permission. That was the day my silence stopped being automatic. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send messages. I didn't ask for explanations. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open. And I read, not emotionally, methodically. I reviewed reports, timelines, and names. I didn't assume guilt, but I didn't dismiss evidence either. I treated the situation the way I would treat a professional problem, calmly, thoroughly, without self-blame. Something else shifted too, my self-concept. I stopped thinking of myself as someone things happen to. I started thinking like someone who needed to respond. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. There was grief in that moment. Nastam kininipshmit. Not for the money yet, but for the illusion. The belief that family automatically meant safety, that trust once earned couldn't be exploited. I mourned quietly. Then I got to work. That day didn't change my relationships outwardly. No one noticed anything different. I still answered messages, still showed up, still played my part. But internally, the story had changed. I was no longer waiting for someone to explain. I was no longer assuming I was mistaken. I was no longer prioritizing comfort over clarity. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. Because the most dangerous thing isn't being betrayed, it's being unwilling to name it when it happens. And from that day on, I stopped looking for reassurance. I started looking for the truth. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to because it felt easier, kinder, less disruptive. Now, it was intentional, measured, chosen. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint that I knew more. I let the version of me they were comfortable with continue to exist. I listened, I nodded, I responded normally. And in doing so, I learned just how much people reveal when they believe there is no risk. They mistook my quiet for ignorance, for confusion, for compliance. That misunderstanding gave me space. Conversations around me grew looser. Details slipped out casually. Timelines overlapped in ways they shouldn't have. People contradicted themselves without noticing. No one expected me to remember because they didn't think I was paying attention. But I was. I started noticing how often my name was invoked as a stabilizer, as reassurance, as collateral, even when no one used that word. It was spoken with confidence, like something already secured, and still no one asked me. What struck me most wasn't malice, it was comfort. They were comfortable assuming I would absorb the consequences, comfortable believing that if things went wrong, I would understand, comfortable placing weight on me without checking whether I was braced for it. Silence, I realized, had trained them well. I began documenting everything. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just carefully. Dates, statements, copies of documents I had access to. I didn't confront contradictions, I recorded them. I didn't correct assumptions, I let them stand. Not because I was plotting revenge, because clarity requires patience. There is a kind of power in not interrupting people while they show you who they are. I also noticed something unexpected in myself. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had come from uncertainty, from not knowing whether my instincts were valid. Once I accepted that something real had happened, the fear dissolved into focus. My silence wasn't weakness, it was containment. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped managing emotions that weren't mine. I stopped explaining myself in advance. And the more I withdrew emotionally, the more they leaned in, confident, unguarded, unaware that the ground beneath the arrangement was shifting. This wasn't about outsmarting anyone. It was about stepping out of a role I had been playing unconsciously and deciding how I wanted to move forward as myself. I understood now that confronting too early would only trigger denial, defensiveness, justifications. I didn't want explanations yet. I wanted the full picture. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, I learned more than I ever had when I was trying to keep the peace. Because when people believe you won't challenge them, they stop hiding. And that's when preparation truly begins. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting and started tracking. Not in a paranoid way, not with suspicion dripping from every thought, but with the same calm attention I'd always given to work, to responsibilities, to things that mattered. The difference was that now I mattered too. I built a private system, simple at first, a folder, then subfolders, screenshots labeled with dates, copies of statements, email threads saved offline. I didn't rely on memory anymore. Memory can be argued with, documents can't. I learned how quietly complex things can be when no one thinks you're paying attention. I noticed how timelines shifted depending on who was telling the story, how amounts were rounded down in conversation, but exact on paper, how certain phrases were repeated, almost rehearsed, while others were avoided entirely. No one questioned my interest when I asked neutral questions. Oh, when did that start? Who's handling that now? Did that change recently? I asked the way someone asks when they're already assumed to be on board, curious, not skeptical, helpful, not resistant, and they answered. They told me more than they realized because they believed I was still the same version of me, the one who trusted first, questioned last, and absorbed quietly. What they never noticed was how often they referenced my name without actually involving me. Since it's under Evelyn's name, she won't have an issue with that. It's fine. Evelyn knows. I didn't correct them. I didn't interrupt the narrative. I let them build it fully, layer by layer, until it was clear even to me where the weight rested. I also educated myself, not through panic searches or late-night spirals, but through structured learning. I read about liability, about consent, about how financial responsibility is assigned, and how it's transferred. I learned the difference between authorization and assumption, between access and permission. Each answer brought a strange mix of calm and grief. Calm, because knowledge restores agency. Grief, because it made one thing undeniable: this wasn't an accident. I didn't jump to the worst conclusions. I didn't label anyone a villain, but I stopped protecting their intentions from the evidence. There's a moment when you're preparing quietly where you realize something sobering. The people who benefit most from your silence are rarely watching closely. They assume the system will keep working because it always has. That assumption was my advantage. They never noticed that I stopped volunteering information, that I stopped offering reassurance, that I no longer fill emotional gaps in conversations. I was present, polite, neutral, and that neutrality made them comfortable. Too comfortable. They never noticed how I asked for copies just to stay organized, or how I followed up on details weeks later with a tone that suggested continuity, not concern. They didn't notice because they had never needed to monitor me before. I had always been safe. I also started preparing emotionally, not for confrontation, but for detachment. I asked myself difficult questions in private. What would accountability look like if it cost me closeness? What mattered more, being seen as loyal or being safe? Was I willing to be misunderstood if it meant being protected? I didn't answer those questions right away. I just let them sit. One night, I realized something that shifted the ground again. If I disappeared tomorrow, emotionally, financially, structurally, the system they'd built would wobble. That wasn't arrogance. It was an observation. They had mistaken my steadiness for something they owned. And ownership, once assumed, is rarely examined. So I kept preparing, quietly, methodically, without drama, without threats, without announcements. Because the strongest position is the one no one thinks you're building. And by the time they noticed anything had changed, it wouldn't be because I raised my voice. It would be because the ground they were standing on no longer belonged to them. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and whispered. I knew it. No sense of triumph, no urge to call anyone immediately. It came quietly, late at night, with a document I almost didn't open. I had been organizing files, cross-checking dates, matching statements, confirming what I already suspected, when I noticed an inconsistency that didn't align with the story I'd been told. It was small, just a detail most people would skim past, but it didn't fit, so I followed it. That's how the truth finally surfaced. Not as a shock, but as a confirmation. The loan wasn't informal, it wasn't temporary, it wasn't something in progress or about to be explained. It was finalized, approved, active. $90,000 in my name, not as a co-signer who had been consulted, not as a beneficiary, as the primary identifier, the one legally responsible if anything went wrong. And no one had told me. I stared at the screen for a long time, long enough for my tea to go cold, long enough to notice that my hands weren't shaking. What I felt wasn't anger, it was a hollow clarity, because in that moment, everything lined up, the assumptions, the casual confidence, the way my name had been used as a resource instead of an identity. This wasn't a misunderstanding layered on top of good intentions. This was a decision. I read every page slowly. Terms, dates, signatures. The structure was clean, professional, and deliberate. Someone had known exactly what they were doing, and someone had known exactly why they weren't including me. Consent would have complicated things. I closed my laptop and sat in silence, not to dramatize the moment, but to absorb it, to let myself feel the weight without rushing to soften it for anyone else. There was grief, real grief, not just for the trust that had been broken, but for the version of my family I had believed in, the one that wouldn't cross certain lines, the one who would stop before stepping on me. That version no longer existed. What surprised me most was the absence of urgency. I didn't feel the need to act immediately. I didn't feel desperate to confront. The clarity had done something strange. It had slowed me down. When you finally know the truth, panic loses its grip. I realized then that I had leverage, not in the sense of power over people, but in the sense of choice. I could decide how this story moved forward. I could decide what accountability looked like. I could decide whether this ended in chaos or in consequence. And that decision didn't require noise. I didn't celebrate the discovery. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Because once you see the full shape of something, you can't unknow it. And once you stop protecting other people from the reality of what they've done, you free yourself to respond honestly. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was spiraling, but because I was recalibrating. I wasn't asking why anymore, I was asking what now. And I knew the next choice I made would change everything. The morning after the reveal, I woke up clear-headed. Not calm exactly, but steady. The kind of steadiness that comes when uncertainty has been replaced by facts. I made breakfast, answered emails, and moved through my routine like any other day. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. I sat down later with the notebook and wrote out my options. Not emotionally, practically. I didn't dramatize them. I didn't soften them either. I could confront them immediately, demand explanations, watch the story splinter into defensiveness, tears, and justifications. I knew how that would go. I had seen it play out in smaller conflicts before. The focus would shift from the act itself to how hurt they felt being accused. I could do nothing, absorb the responsibility quietly, as I had absorbed so much before. Protect the family image, preserve closeness at the cost of my own security. That option was familiar, comfortable in a dangerous way. Or I could choose the path that didn't require permission, the irreversible one. That path didn't involve humiliation or revenge. It didn't involve exposing anyone publicly. It involved boundaries, formal, documented, enforceable boundaries. I understood then that timing mattered. Acting too early would collapse the structure before I fully understood it. Acting too late would trap me in it. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about removing myself from a position I had never consented to occupy. I thought about what I was willing to lose: comfort, approval, the illusion of harmony. I weighed those against what I stood to lose if I stayed silent: financial stability, legal safety, self-respect. The choice became obvious. I decided not to confront first. I decided to move first. That decision felt heavier than any argument ever could. Because once you act without announcing it, you accept that you may be misunderstood, that people will rewrite the narrative to make sense of the consequences they didn't anticipate. I accepted that. I also accepted that my family might never see this from my perspective. That accountability rarely feels fair to the people who never expected it. But clarity had given me something I hadn't had before: resolve without anger. I didn't want apologies shaped by fear. I didn't want promises made under pressure. I wanted outcomes that didn't depend on anyone's feelings. So I planned my next steps carefully, quietly, in the correct order. I knew that once I began, there would be no resetting to the old dynamic. No return to being the reliable one who absorbed everything with a smile. The moment I stepped out of that role, the system would have to adjust or break. And I was prepared for either. Because the hardest part wasn't discovering the betrayal. It was deciding that I mattered enough to respond. That was the point of no return. Once the decision was made, I didn't rush. I learned early that urgency is often what gives you away. It creates tells, emotional leaks, premature confrontations, half-formed actions that invite interference. I didn't want noise. I wanted precision. So I moved quietly. I started with information, not opinions, not family narratives, facts. I verified everything independently: balances, payment histories, authorization trails. I confirmed exactly where my responsibility began and where it could legally end. I didn't assume I understood it all just because my name was on the paperwork. Assumptions were what had put me here. I scheduled appointments that looked ordinary on the outside, administrative, routine, the kind of things no one asks about because they sound boring. No one noticed. I adjusted my finances subtly. Nothing dramatic, no sudden withdrawals or visible panic. Just careful repositioning, buffers where there hadn't been any, protections where there had once been trust. I stopped being available in small ways, not enough to raise concern, just enough to create distance. I didn't volunteer updates, I didn't reassure, I didn't offer to handle it. And the absence went unnoticed at first. That's the strange thing about systems built on one person's quiet labor. They don't recognize the work until it stops. I made sure every step I took was documented, legitimate, and aligned with reality, not with guilt, not with loyalty, not with fear. I didn't want shortcuts. I wanted outcomes that would stand even if no one believed my intentions. At no point did I announce what I was doing. There were moments when someone would mention the loan casually, confidently, as if it were still a shared understanding. I listened. I responded neutrally. I let the assumption exist because correcting it too early would only invite resistance. They thought nothing had changed. They were wrong. What changed wasn't visible yet. It was structural, like removing a support beam slowly, deliberately, making sure the building wouldn't collapse on the wrong person. I also prepared myself emotionally, not for guilt, but for reaction. I rehearsed calmly. I practiced saying less than I wanted to. I reminded myself that explanations are not always owed, especially when consent was never requested in the first place. This wasn't secrecy, it was privacy. There's a difference. Secrecy hides wrongdoing, privacy protects boundaries, and for the first time in a long time, I was protecting mine. I didn't feel powerful during this phase. I felt quiet, focused, almost invisible again, but this time by choice. They still believed I was carrying the weight. I was actually setting it down, one step at a time. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived in confusion. A payment didn't process the way someone expected. A timeline shifted. An assumption failed quietly, without explanation. At first, it was written off as a minor hiccup, an administrative delay, a technical issue, nothing worth worrying about. I heard about it indirectly. A passing comment, a distracted tone, the kind of inconvenience people mention only because they expect it to resolve itself. It didn't. The next time it came up, there was uncertainty in the room. Not panic, just discomfort. People started asking questions, but not the right ones. They asked what had happened, not why. They searched for fixes inside the same structure that was already changing beneath them. They still didn't come to me. That was the part that struck me the most. Even when the system started wobbling, they assumed I was holding it steady somewhere out of sight. They believed I was still buffering the impact, smoothing the edges, absorbing the stress quietly like I always had. But I wasn't. What I had done, carefully, legitimately, had shifted responsibility back to where it belonged. Not dramatically, not vindictively, just accurately. The loss they began to feel wasn't sudden. It crept in. Missed expectations, reduced flexibility, a tightening they couldn't quite explain. Conversations changed. The casual confidence disappeared. Reassurances sounded thinner. People started double-checking things they'd never questioned before. And still, no one connected it to me. Because the idea that I might step out of the role they'd assigned me didn't exist in their mental framework yet. I was still the reliable one, still fine with it, still understanding. That belief delayed their awareness, but it didn't prevent the consequences. I noticed the shift in how they spoke. Less certainty, more frustration. A creeping edge of stress. They tried to hide behind normalcy. The tone wasn't accusatory yet, it was confused. Confusion is the first stage of accountability. It's the moment when people realize something has changed, but haven't yet accepted that it won't change back. I stayed calm, consistent, neutral. I didn't insert myself into the problem. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't rescue. That restraint was harder than anything else I'd done so far, because I could have stepped in. I knew how. I always had. But stepping in would have restored the old balance and erased the boundary I had finally drawn. So I let the discomfort exist, not as punishment, as reality. The consequences weren't loud, but they were undeniable. And once reality enters the room, it doesn't leave just because people wish it would. They were starting to feel what I had felt for months. Uncertainty without explanation, responsibility without consent, pressure without clarity, and for the first time, it wasn't mine alone. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, The language had changed. It wasn't casual anymore. It wasn't a delay or a small issue. It was urgent. Voices lowered, messages came more frequently. The same people who once brushed off my questions were now asking many of their own. What changed wasn't just the situation, it was the tone. Confusion hardened into concern. Concern sharpened into anxiety, and anxiety, when it has nowhere to land, turns into panic. They started looking for reassurance. Not solutions, reassurance. That's when they came to me. At first, gently, a check-in disguised as a conversation. Everything okay on your end? You've been quiet lately. We might need to coordinate. I listened. I responded politely. I didn't offer what they were really asking for, because by then, fixing it wasn't possible without undoing the boundary I had already established. There's a moment in situations like this when people realize that the system they relied on no longer exists, but they still believe it should. They start scrambling for ways to restore it without acknowledging why it collapsed in the first place. They wanted me to step back into the role, to smooth things over, to make it go away quietly. But that role required my consent, and that consent was no longer available. The urgency escalated. Explanations were offered. Too quickly, too late. Stories shifted. Justifications appeared. I heard words like miscommunication, temporary, and we meant to tell you. None of those words addressed the core issue. This wasn't about forgetting to inform me. It was about choosing not to. By the time panic set in, the options had narrowed. The decisions I had made quietly were already in motion. Reversing them would have required me to accept responsibility again, voluntarily, knowingly, after understanding the risk. I wouldn't do that. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. There was frustration in their voices now. Not anger at first, confusion mixed with disbelief. The idea that I might not rescue the situation felt impossible to them, as if I were violating an unspoken contract I'd never agreed to sign. I didn't argue. I didn't explain in circles. I didn't justify myself. I let the reality stand on its own, and that's when regret entered the room. Not remorse, not yet, regret, the realization that something valuable had been mishandled, and the person who once protected them from consequences was no longer doing so. By then, it was too late to fix it quietly. The structure had changed. The responsibility had shifted. The silence that once protected everyone else was now protecting me, and no amount of urgency could rewind that. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic accusations, just a quiet, unavoidable moment where avoidance stopped working. We sat at the same table where so many assumptions had been made. The atmosphere wasn't hostile, it was strained, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. They spoke first, carefully, cautiously, as if choosing the right words might still restore something. There were explanations, layered and overlapping, intentions emphasized, circumstances highlighted. The same phrases I had heard before, now delivered with urgency instead of confidence. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct details unless they were factually wrong. I didn't raise my voice or sharpen my tone. I didn't need to. When it was my turn, I spoke simply. I said I hadn't been informed. I said my consent hadn't been requested. I said responsibility had been placed on me without my agreement. I didn't argue about motives. I didn't accuse anyone of malice. I didn't demand apologies. I just stated facts. That was harder for them than anger would have been, because facts don't escalate. They don't soften. They don't allow for emotional detours. They sit there, immovable, waiting to be acknowledged. There was silence after I finished speaking. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where people realize they don't have a rebuttal that doesn't make things worse. Someone asked what I wanted. It was a sincere question, maybe the first one. I told them I wanted what should have existed from the beginning: transparency, boundaries, and responsibility aligned with decision-making. I told them I wasn't punishing anyone. I was correcting a structure that never should have included me without my consent. I didn't threaten. I didn't gloat. I didn't retreat. I held the line calmly. That calm unsettled them more than anger ever could, because anger invites defense. Calm forces reflection. They saw then that this wasn't a phase. It wasn't a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a boundary that had already been enacted, not one being negotiated. The conversation ended without resolution, not because it failed, but because resolution requires acceptance, and acceptance takes time. I left feeling lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally spoken without abandoning myself. That was enough. I am not the same person I was before this happened. Not because I became harder, not because I lost my capacity for empathy, but because I stopped confusing endurance with virtue. For a long time, I believed being good meant being accommodating, that being loving meant being flexible. That strength looked like silence. I don't believe that anymore. Now, when people describe me, they still use some of the same words: calm, thoughtful, reliable, but there's a difference in how those qualities live inside me. They are no longer available on demand. They are offered by choice. I don't explain myself as much. I don't over-prepare defenses for boundaries that don't need justification. I let discomfort exist without rushing to resolve it for others. That change has altered my relationships. Some grew quieter. Some are more distant. A few surprised me by becoming more honest, and a couple never recovered. Not because I destroyed them, but because they were built on access I no longer provide. I've learned that losing proximity isn't the same as losing connection, and keeping everyone close at the expense of yourself isn't love, it's erasure. There is no bitterness in me about what happened. There is sadness, yes, but it's clean, processed, no longer sharp. What replaced it is something steadier: self-trust. I trust my instincts now when something feels off. I trust my right to pause, to question, to say no without offering a detailed explanation. I trust that clarity is kinder than silence, even when it costs me approval. I also understand something I didn't before. Quiet people are often watching more closely than anyone realizes. And when they stop carrying the weight they never agreed to hold, the absence is felt immediately. But that absence is not cruelty. It's correct. I didn't win anything in a dramatic sense. There was no triumphant ending, no applause. What I gained was alignment between what I value and how I live. And that alignment has changed the way I move through the world. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still capable of forgiveness. But I am no longer invisible. There's a moment after everything settles when you're left alone with what the story actually taught you. Not the dramatic version, not the version people retell to make themselves comfortable. Just the truth, stripped down. For me, the truth was this: betrayal didn't arrive as cruelty. It arrived as an assumption. Assumption that my stability was infinite. Assumption that my silence meant agreement. The assumption that love didn't require consent once history had been established. Betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes wrapped in familiarity, delivered by people who are so used to your reliability that they forget you are a person before you are a resource. What happened to me wasn't about money alone, even though the number was large enough to change the course of my life. It was about how easily responsibility can be transferred to the person least likely to resist. How often "you'll understand" is used to avoid asking permission. How silence, when misunderstood, becomes an invitation. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly. I was wrong. Real strength was choosing to respond without becoming cruel, to set boundaries without rewriting myself as the villain, to act without needing to be witnessed, applauded, or validated. I didn't explode. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't burn everything down. I simply stopped absorbing what was never mine to carry. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, irreversible, changed the entire structure around me. If there's one moral in this story, it's not trust no one. It's not family will betray you. Those are easy conclusions, and they let people avoid the harder truth. The harder truth is this: trust without boundaries isn't trust, it's exposure. Loving someone doesn't require sacrificing your safety. Being patient doesn't require surrendering your agency. And being calm does not mean you are obligated to be endlessly accommodating. You're allowed to notice patterns. You're allowed to pause when something feels off. You're allowed to protect yourself without becoming loud, bitter, or unrecognizable. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others, it's about control over yourself. Since this happened, I've had people ask me if I regret how things ended up. The honest answer is no. I regret that it had to happen at all, but I don't regret choosing myself once I finally saw the full picture. Because the cost of staying silent would have been far higher than the cost of being misunderstood. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've been the reliable one, the strong one, the person everyone leans on without checking whether you're standing on solid ground, I want you to know this. You don't have to wait for a dramatic breaking point to honor your boundaries. You don't have to prove your pain for it to be valid. And you don't owe anyone access to your life simply because they're used to it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining and start choosing. I'd like to leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized too late that staying quiet had taught someone they didn't need your consent?